Some roads are cursed. They don't just take you somewhere, they take something from you. He knew war, he knew death, but this was different. The road stretched endlessly into the dark and the silence. It wasn't just silence. It was something watching, something waiting. Then came the whispers. Then, the thing in the road, tall, wrong, smiling. His instincts screamed to run, but deep down he knew this wasn't something you could escape. This was something that had already chosen him. Because some wars never end, and some nightmares, they don't let you wake up.
The road went on and on into the darkness of the night, cutting through the thick, dead forest like a scar across the ground. There were no streetlights, moon, or stars in the sky. There was only a black hole that swallowed everything in its path. The soldiers' fingers turned white as they touched the leather of the wheel. It was very quiet, and the only sound was the engine hum. It was there with them the whole time. His worn-out clothes stuck to his skin and were stained with sweat and fight scars. The Glock 19 was stored in the glove box, close enough to be reached quickly. Under the dim dashboard light, a bottle of whiskey that hadn't been opened stood next to him. He wasn't sure why he brought it. It could be a habit. It could be something else. But as the miles went by, something else became heavy than being tired. Something not seen. Noise on the radio was the first sign. A short flash of noise, and then quiet took back the throne. Then there were whispers. At first, they seemed far away, like wind blowing through old cracks in a house. Then, his name, softly spoken, stretched out of place. He grabbed the dial and turned it off with a sharp twist. The quiet came back, but the car's air felt different. It smelled like wet earth, and it was strong and sweet. His heart beat faster. Training told people how to manage, think, and act. But discipline alone couldn't explain what came next. The headlights cut through the darkness and hit something in the middle of the road. A figure, tall, too thin, and with arms that don't look right in any way. The arms were too long and bent like dead trees. The legs were too long for a person, and the grotesque body barely held it up. But it was the face that made him shorten his breath. Not because it was crazy scary, it was worse. Like a person, it was. The smile is too wide and stretched out. Too deep and empty, eyes that look like black holes. It was so deeply wrong that it stirred up something basic in him. My gut told me there was danger. The work from years ago paid off. He didn't think twice. Putting your foot on the pedal, speeding up, and cutting the gap. Impact was bound to happen. He got ready for the sound of bones and flesh crunching under the tire. It never did come though. The car went right through it like it was smoke. After that, everything stopped. The engine stopped working. The lights went out and on again. There was nothing but silence in the world. It was like time itself was moving more slowly. Even his heartbeat seemed to slow down. The first sound then came. A cut, light and careful, from above. He had trouble breathing. This time the scratch is on the passenger door. Very long, very slow, very drawn out. Even though his heart was racing in his ears, he reached for the glove box with steady finger. With his gun in hand, he took a deep breath, stood up, and swung the door open. He was sucked up by the cold night air. He was trained and quick on his feet. 3 shots. In the dark, muzzle flash tore through everything. The sounds went on and on until they were gone. No chain. There was no scream of pain. It was still there, but it was now closer. There is no shift or chain. Right there. It turned its head and looked at him with a blank stare. It then laughed. Not just one person, but many. There was a chorus of whispers that were stacked and jumbled, and each one was close to being crazy. His muscles tightened up like steel as he tensed up. He had seen war, death, and the worst in people. What this was, though, was beyond understanding. He could feel the ground getting softer and the air getting thicker. Reality changed and fell apart. The car was not there. There was no road. There had never been a forest. He wasn't anywhere. He was still there, though. It was morning, but he wasn't there. His car was damaged, but the engine was still working when they found it on the side of the road. Just an empty car that was left behind for no reason. But a single word was scratched into the window very deeply. War. And the laughter went on somewhere, past the veil of the known. It wasn't quiet in the void. At first, the silence seemed like an empty space that swallowed up all signs of reality. But the more time he spent there, the more he realized the void was living. The whispers weren't just sound, they were movements, flickers of being there that were just out of his range of hearing. He felt the edges of his awareness being pushed by something big and unseen that went around him. He held on tighter to the Glock, but the weight made him feel bad. It should have been calming to touch the cold steel, but it wasn't. It was going away, like smoke slipping out of his hand. He squeezed it tight, but the more he did it, the less real it felt. He got a chill up his spine. He had done impossible things before, but this was different. It wasn't just war, it was too much. If you can call it that, the ground moved under him. It shook and stretched, and all of a sudden, he was falling. It's not through the air or space, but through something else. It felt like you were being pulled through different layers of reality, each one speaking its own truth. Thoughts of something, memories, made him catch his breath. Thoughts blinked through the darkness. An area of war, with people on fire and smoke rising over them. The laughing of a child, far away and wrong. Too many hands and shadows are reaching out to grab him. Then came the crash. When he hit the ground hard, his breath left his lung. On the ground below him, dirt and leaves crunched. The feeling was so sudden and real that it shook him. He coughed and rolled over on his back, looking up at the sky. A sky that wasn't really sky. It was like a canvas that was spread out in front of him, with moving forms, colors, and shadows that moved across the surface like oil on water. The smell in the air was off, old, damp, and mixed with metal. He slowly got up and looked around the area. There were trees around him, but they weren't trees. Their bark was smooth and pulsed like skin that was too tight over bone. The trees were tall and thin. It was quiet in the dense bush. There is no wind. Don't move the leaves around. No life. He wasn't by himself. Something was watching from just beyond the tree. He felt it but couldn't see it. The weight of its gaze pressed against his mind, making the base of his head feel like it was moving. The words came back, this time closer, and went through his mind like fingers running along the edges of his awareness. War. The word shook the air and cut into the space around him like a rule that wasn't being said. His senses told him to run, hide, and get weapons, but what were they telling him to do? Even though he reached for his Glock, nothing was there. It was no longer there. His stuff, like his belt and knife, was also heavy. He had nothing on but his tired clothes and the smell of something old and wrong that stuck to his skin. The feeling in the trees changed. He quickly turned, bracing his feet and tensing his muscles, but there was nothing there. Just the strange silence of the twisted forest. He knew better, though. He knew someone was after him. The rumors got stronger. There was something coming. This time, he didn't have a tool or anyone to help him. He was by himself. He kept his breath steady and in check because he had trained to do so, but something basic was stirring inside him. Gut feeling. The kind that warned men before a sniper's scope could reach them. The kind that gave you the creeps before an attack. It wasn't war, though. He didn't know anything about this. It got worse after that. The trees were more than just trees. They breathed, making small changes to their shape that were hard to notice until they weren't. He was sure that one was closer than before. The bark on it was pulsing a little, like it were alive below the surface. He took a slow step back, and his boots hit the wet, strange ground. It wasn't muddy, but the ground was soft. It wasn't that, like flesh. He chose not to think about it. He had to have a gun. He had to find his way. He had to get up. His eyes darted through the trees, looking for anything that looked like a way out. The scenery, on the other hand, turned and folded in on itself like a dream trying to remember its shape. No distance or sky, just that undulating mass in the sky that was moving because of forces we can't see. Things that were mechanical and familiar could be felt in the thick air. Blood, not better. Now, the rumors were getting closer. Thoughts were smashed against by understanding, not words or language. It was like broken glass beating against thought. And now I have to ask, what would you do in this situation? The soldier is trapped in something far beyond war, facing something that doesn't just kill, it consumes. If you were in his place, would you try to fight, knowing that bullets might not even work? Or would you run and risk stepping deeper into the unknown? Let me know in the comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. You don't belong here. His muscles got tight. It wasn't far away anymore that someone was in the tree. It was right here, looking at, waiting. He got up. First he moved slowly, then faster. He measured and controlled every step, as if his body were just trying to stay alive. He could feel the pressure in his mind rising, wrongness creeping in around the edges of reality. His training told him only one thing: watch, change, and stay alive. After that, movement. In the edges, something moved. A flash of black against the tree's void-colored leaves. He turned around and raised his hands, but it didn't help much against whatever had pulled him here. But impulse didn't care about what made sense. The thing moved again, but he couldn't see it. A blur of long arms and angles that don't make sense. It was a game with him. It's a test. Then there was laughing. Not a person. It's not normal. There were 1,000 voices whispering and screeching at the same time, mixing and mixing, getting under his skin and into his mind. It wasn't coming from just one spot. It was everywhere. Then there was pain. It was white hot and felt like a drill bit going through his head. He stumbled, and his knees were almost giving out. His vision was blurry. Even though his body was screaming, "Move," the pain was holding him still and locking his limbs together. He had to bear the raw invasion of something that no one could understand. A lot of pictures came to his mind. He saw a battlefield, but it wasn't one he knew. There were men fighting, but their faces were not showing. The sky broke open, and a huge thing came falling. An image of himself that was skewed, incorrect, and happy in a way he had never done. The pain went away. Taking a step forward, he gasped and felt cold sweat on his skin. His heart was beating like a war drum, and he was having trouble breathing. But there were no more whispers. The forest had also changed. The trees were no longer far away. They were now huge and looming over him. Their pulsing bark was changing and taking on forms that were almost human but not quite. Looking at, waiting, a test. This did not happen by chance. This was done on purpose. Figured out. He was here for a reason, because of something. It wasn't over with him yet. He felt like someone was pushing down on his senses from behind in the twisted forest. The silence was alive. As soon as each breath left his mouth, he felt like it was being taken away. The trees were big and moved slowly when he wasn't looking, like they were waiting for their chance to attack. They were a threat, but not the real one. He now knew that. He was here because of something else. Something had been following, testing. It was still here. It was clear to him. There was something strange in the air that made it thicker, and a heavy force wrapped around it. Then there was a movement around the edges. A shadow moving through trees that are bent out of shape, slow and careful. It wasn't trying to hide, it wanted him to see. It felt like letting him know it was there. Then I heard a voice. This time there was no whisper. A sound that seemed to scrape against the very fabric of being. You are a thing of war. The words were not said. They were made to do it. Forced into his head, it was full of old-fashioned evil that made his skin crawl. After that, it moved forward. What had been watching him? It was very tall, much taller than a person should be, and its long limbs moved around like they weren't made of real matter. Its flesh, if you could even call it that, was a deep, writhing black that looked like a live shadow wrapped around a person. Its arms hung at strange angles, and its fingers were too long and had something jagged on the tips of them, like bone being pushed through torn skin. But it was the face that made his spine chill. A joke about people. A smile that was stretched out and curled much more than a human mouth could do. Tore and cracked lips showed teeth, too many teeth. Some were sharp, others were like needles, and they were stacked in rows and rows, moving around like they were breathing. And the eyes were empty holes that ate up the light but could still see everything. It did not have a name in any tongue, but he knew what it was in the space between his thoughts, where fear spoke the truth. Zarathush, the person who planned the Forgotten Wars. Something that existed before people fought, before states drew lines in the sand, and before the first blade touched blood. It was very old. Nothing good or evil, something worse. Something that lived on war, fed on it, and made it happen. Now, it had picked him. When Zal-Zirath took a step forward, its body moved and twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Every move was off. It was more like a stutter, like a film loop missing frame. You have killed, you have bled, you have made war, and now, war has made you. His heart was beating fast against his rib. He tried hard to stay strong, but his gut told him that this was something more dangerous than guns, knives, or anything humans could understand. Zal-Zirath wasn't here to kill him, though. Not yet. It didn't want that, though. He was told to remember. The pressing, Unbearable pressure in his head came back. He got down on one knee and dug his hands into the wet, moving ground. A lot of memories came back to me at once. I remembered battlefields I had forgotten, soldiers screaming their last breath into the ground, and towns on fire. However, these were not his thought. These were wars that never took place, wars that were over. He recognized himself in them. A fight, in charge, killing, over and over, in places that weren't there, against enemy forces that didn't have name, in wars that didn't happen, as if they never happened. After that, he got it. There was more to Zal-Zirath than just war. Someone was in charge. A person who gets fights that never happened. Something that started wars and then erased them, eating their echoes and living on the pain to make sure no one remembered except those it chose to remember. Now, it had picked him. You will serve. He felt like the words were shooting through his mind, shaking his very sense of who he was. Something cold moved under his skin and wrapped itself around his bones like sharpened wire, making his muscles lock together. He could see it now, not just the thing that was in front of him, but also the war that it was fighting across the void. There were battles that happened in the past and troops who died in wars that never happened. And he was just the next part of the big plan. A man who was forced to fight in a war that no one would ever remember. The worst part? Something deep inside, hidden under the fear and pain. He wanted it in some way. He could no longer handle the weight in his head, which was pressing against the walls of his mind like a vice around his idea. When his knees hit the ground, the pulsing earth beneath him shook as if it liked the sound of his fall. A huge figure called Zal-Zirath stood over him. Its shape was shifting and twitching in horrifying expectation. Now there were no more whispers. Now there was no need for them. That which spoke spoke. It had picked. His body was shaking as images burned into his mind like melted steel, ripping through his mind. There were wars that never took place. Men's faces who had never been alive. The sound of guns firing in fights that didn't happen in real life. He made fists with his hands, but there was nothing fixed in this dream that was changing all the time. He fought it. He tried to fight back. But this wasn't a fight. There was no enemy for him to shoot and no task to finish. He was already behind in this mental battle, which was already over. Zal-Zirath reached out, and its fingers grew longer and split into thin, lanky limbs that reached unimaginably far. They didn't have to touch him, but they didn't. They went deep into him, cutting through the fabric of his mind. They brought memories to the surface and twisted and warped them. The conflict from his past, the one he had lived through, changed right in front of his eyes. He had fought with men whose faces had melted, warped, and stretched into empty, grinning mouths. The metal on their weapons turned to rust, and their uniforms were torn apart, showing flesh and sinew. The ground below them shook, and bodies fell into it like men who are drowning and are being sucked up by tar. When he tried to move, his legs didn't belong to him. The screams then started, not from the front line, not from the troops who are dying, from him. He wasn't just seeing memories, that's why. He was living them all over again. Every bullet that had ever gone through his body, every knife that had ever cut him had been sharp. Every scary moment when death was only inches away from him. Now it was worse, much worse, because there was no end this time. Not a comfort. You can't pass out from lack of blood or become asleep. I felt like the pain would never end, like a broken film reel playing over and over again. Zal-Zirath watched it all happen. Learn, fed. He was yelling so hard that his throat hurt, but he could no longer make any noise. He was shaking, but he couldn't fall because there was no ground. The war went on and on. There was only war. Then something else. A whisper. It's not from Zal-Zirath, not from nowhere, from himself. It wasn't his own thought, but it had always been there. As he fought it, there was a truth waiting for him to break. You were never meant to survive. His breath shook. His heart stopped beating. He saw it all of a sudden. The truth. The real war. Not the ones he had really fought. Not the ones Zal-Zirath showed him, but the war inside him. The times he had pushed deep down inside him. On those nights, he had been by himself with a bottle, and his past had been like a gravestone over him. The many faces of the dead, the ones he couldn't save and the ones he had already killed. Even after he got home, the war never stopped. He had not been taken by Zal-Zirath. It had just found him, found the holes in his head and the wounds that would never heal. It hadn't made him do this. It had only opened the door. He had also walked through it. As things fell apart around him, his body shook. He was left with nothing after the battlefield, and the trees disappeared. No sight, nothing. Not myself, only war. Then Zalzirath spoke one last time. You are home. He was, too. Because they couldn't get away. There wasn't ever. The soldier's body stayed in the real world. It was slumped in the driver's seat of his abandoned car, his eyes empty and his mouth slightly open as if he were screaming. But his mind was gone, stuck. They were in a war that would never end. A war that no one would ever remember. He thought he knew the worst of war, but the true terror was beyond anything a human could endure. What if I told you this wasn't the only time someone vanished without explanation? In the next video, you'll uncover another story that was never meant to be told. But be careful, some mysteries don't want to be discovered. Click now and see for yourself.